is I'm going to have a conversation with Jules, which you can all listen in on, and we'll have questions from the floor before the night is over. I met Jules Witcover probably about 30 years ago. He covers campaigns. I'm a political operative, and I always had the reputation among the political reporters as the one political operative that never used the words off the record. And so therefore I was always a good quote. And we were reliving today and driving over here the amount of times that my quotes to Jules got me in trouble with who I was working with. I've survived, he survived, and tonight I'm sort of turning the tables on him, where I get to ask him questions as opposed to him asking me questions. The book that you're going to receive tonight after we're finished is his current book, but I want to call your attention to this is a book that has not received a lot of attention. It's his autobiography, and it's called The Makings of an Ink-Stained Wretch. And if you like politics and you want to read a great storyteller who's been covering politics since 1952, and looking around this room tonight, I see a lot of us remember 1952. This is a great book to read. It's a great read and by a great storyteller. I have a little cheat sheet here in terms of my questions, and what I thought we'd do tonight is to basically talk about Jules's history in politics, because we're all of that age where we remember back when. I'll leave any questions about 2008 and the current crop to questions later on, but I really want to go back and reminisce here, because there's an opportunity that we won't have too often to talk about the past. So my first question, Jules, is: should Nixon have pardoned Jerry Ford?
Well, he didn't ask me.
Well, I'm asking you.
I mean, Nixon pardoned.
I'm sorry. Jerry Ford pardoned Nixon. Of course, you couldn't answer that question. It was the wrong question.
I thought I'd missed something there.
Yeah. Ford pardoned Nixon.
I don't think he should have. I think that the process should have run its course. I think it would have been better for the country and better for history to have it run its course. In the immediate sense, it may well have cost Gerald Ford a presidency in his own right, a term in his own right. In a very, very close election with Jimmy Carter, anything could have changed the outcome of that election. I personally believe that Gerald Ford would have been elected in his own right if he hadn't pardoned Nixon. But I think more important is the historical importance of not letting the whole matter run its course. I would have preferred to see that happen. I would have preferred to see that Nixon had not resigned, and that he had gone through the impeachment process. Although I've been a strong supporter in many ways of Bill Clinton, I think it was correct to have him undergo impeachment, because to me, never mind the various tantalizing and titillating aspects of the Clinton story. To me, a president of the United States lying to a grand jury should be, and I think is, an impeachable offense. There was never any question that Bill Clinton would be acquitted in the Senate, as he was. So I think Nixon should have run the same gamut, but I don't think he would have been acquitted by the Senate, because a number of Republican senators went to Nixon and told him that he didn't have the votes, and that was really the reason that Nixon finally did agree to resign, because he knew he faced certain impeachment.
Okay, let's jump to something else here. On Sunday night, when Congressman Lewis was here, he shared with us that he was in Indianapolis with Bobby Kennedy the night they found out that Martin Luther King was killed, and he also was in Los Angeles the night that Robert Kennedy was assassinated. So was Jules Witcover on both occasions. So why don't you give us your reminiscence of those two events, which you talk about in detail in your book?
Well, I was in Indianapolis, but I was not at the event when Robert Kennedy learned of the assassination of Martin Luther King and reported it to an African American rally in Indianapolis. But I've seen it on television. I've listened to the tapes a number of times, and it's probably one of the most moving episodes that I've ever encountered in politics. He demonstrated in that talk a very unusual rapport with the audience, and he related in it, if you recall this, the death of his own brother in the hands of an assassin, and how he shared the grief that the black audience experienced. But I was in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, about a distance from here to this first table here, when Robert Kennedy was shot. I was standing on the speaker's platform in the Ambassador Hotel ballroom when Robert Kennedy made his victory speech right after the California primary, and it was by that time about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the East, very close to deadline time for newspapers, which counted in those days, and so we all turned and walked through the kitchen to go to this anteroom next to the kitchen for the press conference, and I was walking maybe about 10 feet ahead of Robert Kennedy with my back turned when I heard the shots go off. I turned around, and as soon as I turned around, he was already down on the ground, and there was then ensued an incredible chaotic scene, which I've never yet gotten out of my mind, and oftentimes still dream about it. It was a scene in which many of the reporters lost it. Everybody was racing around. Others were functioning very well, where it's just kind of adrenaline clicked in, and we were able to do our jobs. But I remember after it was all over, I took out my little notebook, which I still have someplace, and tried to read my notes, and it was just a series of scribbles because I was so shaken by the event. And I remember well also the struggle between these two big bodyguards of Robert Kennedy's, one a professional football player and another an Olympic star, trying to get the gun away from the assassin, Sirhan. It seemed to me at the time that it was minutes and minutes before they managed to get it from him, and he was a little guy. And so that was probably, no question, not probably, the most dramatic single episode that I've ever experienced as a reporter. And I then wrote a book about that campaign, which was kind of almost a catharsis for me to recover from that experience.
But 1968 was a defining moment in this country's history and its presidential history.
The whole year actually was. So when you think of the things that happened in that year, it started out with Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run for re-election. It actually started out with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which demonstrated although many military people said it wound up to being an American military victory because so many of the enemy were killed, it psychologically it drove home to the American people the futility of that war, and so Johnson, in the wake of that, announced on television on a Sunday night that he was not going to run for re-election. And it was also at the same time that although he didn't lose the New Hampshire primary, he actually won the New Hampshire primary as a write-in candidate. Senator McCarthy, Eugene McCarthy, running as an anti-war candidate, came so close that it was widely perceived as a defeat for Johnson, and ultimately forced him out of the race and brought Robert Kennedy into the race. Then, within a period of 6 weeks, we had the assassination of Martin Luther King, riots all over the country, and then the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the chaos of the convention, Democratic convention in Chicago, and then winding up with the election of Richard Nixon, who was really not a very popular candidate but survived. So that year and it really was a year in which a lot of hopes were dashed by people who felt that with the war still going on, that there might be a clean break. But it didn't happen. Nixon continued the war, and the hope that had been kindled first by Dr. King on the civil rights front and Robert Kennedy on the political front just vanished, and so it left the country drained. And in my mind, and in my experience, the most tragic and emotional year in all the time I've covered politics.
1968 was my entry into politics. I was at the convention in Chicago in '68, and the only reason I wasn't beaten up was because I was dressed like this and I had a beard and I had a haircut. Otherwise, I probably would have been. Instead of going through each one of the presidential elections you covered, I thought what I'd do is I'm going to throw out a name and give me 2 sentences on the name. Let's start off with your first presidential race. Let's start off with Eisenhower.
Eisenhower was kind of a regal presence, an icon, and unbeatable.
And wasn't he recruited by both parties?
Both parties. Actually, President Truman tried to get him to run in the previous election in 1948, and as a Democrat, and he wouldn't do it. But so he could have been the nominee on either party's ticket. It was not known at the time whether Eisenhower was a Democrat or a Republican. He was a military man, and he kept it to himself.
Okay, why don't we just follow that up with President Kennedy?
Kennedy was a glamour boy, and the country just totally fell for him. He was a very charismatic figure and speaker, and he came into office really not prepared for what was confronting him. He was lied to by the generals in planning the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he started off in a hole, and he struggled his way out, showed a tremendous amount of courage in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and wound up being probably a certain re-election in 1964 if he hadn't been killed. My only add-on to that is that during the missile crisis, I was a freshman in college, and I thought the world was going to come to an end. So I got up enough guts to ask this girl out by saying to her, "Well, why don't we go out before we die?" And she accepted. What a smoothie you were!
I was a smooth guy. What about one of the characters from that period, Pierre Salinger?
Pierre Salinger.
Pierre Salinger.
Pierre Salinger, a former newspaper guy, and who was Kennedy's press secretary, and he was not a very influential member of the Kennedy entourage, but he did play a key role in managing to hoodwink the press by saying Kennedy had caught a cold when he came back from a campaign trip in Chicago to handle the Cuban Missile Crisis, which nobody knew anything about at the time. That was a little lie that Pierre told, but got Kennedy back to Washington without alarming the country.
The next person I want you to talk about is, you did devote a good deal of time in your book, and I'm sure would rank as the top 5 people you ever covered, and that'd be Nixon.
Nixon I knew fairly early. In 1996, when he was in the wilderness, having lost the governorship in California.
66.
Nobody was paying any attention to him, and I got an assignment to spend a week with him in the 1966 congressional campaign, traveling around the South for Republican candidates, and the trip started actually in Detroit, and his press secretary, who was a young fellow named Patrick Buchanan, introduced me to Nixon on the elevator at the hotel the night before the campaign started, and Nixon gave me a courteous nod, but I could see he was very nervous because I was a reporter. Over the next 7 days, we traveled together. I was in his car almost every day, just myself, Patrick Buchanan, and another aide. Each of his little stops for members of the Republican candidates for Congress, and one of the purposes of the trip was to get a good interview with Nixon, and Buchanan kept promising me that he would talk to me, but he didn't for the first 5 or 6 days. And so on the final leg of the trip, we were in Roanoke, Virginia, flying back in a beat-up old propeller plane, and I thought, oh, there goes my interview. When I was called back to the front of the plane, and then had about an hour and a half interview with Nixon, with the noisy propeller planes roaring in my ear, but fortunately had a tape recorder going, and had a fantastic interview with Nixon, in which he made some really remarkable observations of himself. He liked to think of himself as a very introspective man, but the Nixon that he saw didn't square with the Nixon that I saw, what I don't think most other people saw. At one point, he said he was a very intellectual person, that he wished he'd had more time to read good books and write. And he said that in many ways he was very much like Adlai Stevenson. He compared himself to Adlai Stevenson, which was a mind blower as far as I was concerned. But so as a result of that trip, I was able to write the first article in a major magazine in the some of you folks may remember the Saturday Evening Post. In that magazine, saying that Nixon was not finished in politics and was planning to run again. And you know what happened.
Let me just change from former president to one of the great political characters, Tip O'Neill.
Tip was a lot of laughs, and he was deceptively cunning. He was a big, garrulous Irishman who got along well with reporters. They got along well with him. He really Ronald Reagan was known as a charmer, but Tip O'Neill really charmed Ronald Reagan with his Irish jokes. They got to be very good personal pals. But Tip was dead against almost everything Ronald Reagan tried to do, but managed to go through that period being a good friend of Ronald Reagan and vice versa.
But wasn't that an era that's not there anymore, which is this sort of camaraderie, even among combatants, that's not there today?
I think both among politicians and among members of the press, there was competition politically and journalistically, but there was always a sense that once the battle was fought, there was plenty of opportunity to have good relations. And I think that the bitterness that we see in politics today was not present then to near the degree that it is today. And I think that there was real mutual trust among Republicans and Democrats, and you would see the Republicans and Democrats in Congress socializing. You don't see very much of that anymore, and you saw the relationship between reporters and politicians was one of competition and adversary, but not personal bitterness, and I think that there were two reasons that changed. One was the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's deceptions about what was going on in the war and what he was doing, which caused many reporters to lose their confidence in the president and in politicians. And the other was Watergate, where the same thing, that Richard Nixon's lies and shenanigans in the White House developed what ordinarily was a normal skepticism on the part of members of the press to cynicism, a feeling that a sense that you couldn't trust any politician; they were all liars, and particularly with the development of a new generation of reporters who grew up seeing the Woodward and Bernstein's success, personal success, in helping to drive, being critical to driving a president out of office. This on the one hand brought around a certain type of what you could call celebrity journalism that made sometimes some of the journalists thought they were bigger than the people they covered, and on the other hand, you saw politicians trust in getting a fair shake from the press. Not that all that Woodward and Bernstein turned up was not actually absolutely correct, which it was, but politicians began to cut back on the access that they gave to reporters. It was harder to reach them because they were afraid of gotcha journalism. They were afraid that particularly the younger reporters were out to get them.
To some famous operatives, Lee Atwater.
A disciple of Strom Thurmond, who learned his politics in the Deep South and fully embraced the anything goes mentality in politics, and he was totally immersed in politics, and was very effective. But he was in the forefront of that attitude that began to turn politics into the kind of nasty period we're in now.
My quick Lee Atwater story is the day after the 1988 election, Bush has beaten Dukakis. I'm sitting in my office, and the receptionist says, Lee Atwater's on the phone. It's the day after the election. And I have a bunch of, Jerry's kids that are involved in politics who would always do these practical jokes. And I didn't know anybody who imitated Lee Atwater. I had somebody who imitated Ted Kennedy and imitated Jimmy Carter, but not Lee Atwater. And I get on the phone and I said, I know you're looking for a Democrat in the cabinet. I accept, but I want the CIA. And there's a laugh, and he said, Jerry, this is Lee Atwater. And why are you calling me? I want to thank you for you paid me one of the highest compliments because I had to quote the Atlanta Constitution about the race he ran, because even though he was at all risk, he'd do anything he could to win. He had a lot of help from Dukakis, and then he got sick and wind up having renounced everything he did and apologizing to a lot of people that he abused over the years. And a little known fact, for those of you who may have remembered, former Democratic chairman, it was Clinton's Commerce Secretary Ron Brown. Ron Brown, when Atwater was sick in the hospital, would go and read to him, every day, and so there was that camaraderie back. Well, we're sticking on this. Let's talk about another character, James Carville.
A force of nature. He's kind of a flip side of Lee Atwater, without the bitterness. A very amusing and entertaining guy, but very tough and very imaginative. And you could always count on him to come up with clever ways to do the same thing, to get under the skin of the other side. I think of it, you're kind of a Yankee James Carville yourself.
Oh, thank you very much. we both have accents. Let me turn to someone who's going to be here next week, an old buddy of yours, the Prince of Darkness, Bob Novak.
Whenever I say that Bob Novak is a friend of mine and that I like him, I can see that people's eyes roll because he has a persona that he really cultivates. He likes to be the Prince of Darkness, and there's no question that after many years of writing a column with Roland Evans, that was pretty much straight down the middle. They became extremely conservative, and for a while I thought it was just a gamut, because so many editors and so many publishers are Republican. I thought that's the way they get their column into a lot of papers. But I came to realize that they actually, particularly Novak, became a true believer in the conservative faith, and his appearance and demeanor belies a friendliness that nobody seems to believe is possible. But I've read his book. It's a very interesting book, very revealing. And what you see about it, from it more than anything else, and he may be the hardest working journalist in America.
Well, this leads me to ask this question: what makes a good reporter? I mean, what makes a good reporter, and also, do we have good reporters anymore?
Well, what makes a good reporter is first of all shoe leather, willingness to go out and keep going and going, asking questions, reading sometimes to get to the answer, and not giving up, and not being satisfied with doing a half-hearted job. The mark of Woodward and Bernstein was their diligence, constantly going and going and talking to dozens and dozens of people to find out what they were trying to find out. I think that, but I also think beyond that, that need for relentless shoe leather, I think this is something that maybe goes to the second part of your question. I think it has to be acceptance of ethics in journalism, and the need to maintain personal integrity about how you go about doing your job, and checking and double checking, and not dealing with rumor. I think one of the plagues of the internet is the phenomenon of blogging, in which there is no filter. I think there's many good things come from bloggers. A lot of things bloggers come up with that so-called mainstream journalists don't get. But on the downside, I think an awful lot of rumor gets into the airwaves, and faulty information that is not gone through a professional journalistic filter. So I think that reporters today, some are a lot better than they were when I started, and some are not nearly as good. I think many journalists now go through journalism schools, and they are taught the discipline that is required, the ethics, and so on. But I think in some cases, with the allure of personality, being somebody on television, leads to too many reporters taking shortcuts that they didn't take some years ago.
I know there's always sort of been, I don't know if it's a rivalry, but between print reporters and television reporters. But there was one television person which I had the privilege to meet through you, and I want you to talk a little bit about John Chancellor, which I'm sure everybody remembers John Chancellor.
John Chancellor was originally a print reporter. He worked in Chicago on a news service that serviced all the newspapers in the Chicago area, and he was a person who was grounded in the kind of ethical behavior and thoroughness that I was just talking about. When he got into television, he continued with that same discipline, but he became a good friend of many print reporters, and on the campaign trail, he was more often to be found in the presence of print reporters, because he came out of that discipline, and we all particularly admired him because of that. Although he was a celebrity, he didn't wear it easily. He recognized that his presence after a while on a campaign trail could actually take attention away from some candidates. And I'll tell you two stories. I remember once we were out in California at a rally, and the candidate didn't show up right away. I think it was your old candidate, Jesse Jackson, who
a shock, he went on time.
Yeah, who was famous for being late. And so the MC was killing time, and he's looking around. And all of us reporters were penned in a little area for the press, and he was introducing people in the crowd, the MC, and he looked over and he said, over there, he said, there's a living legend, John Chancellor from NBC. So thereafter, Chancellor was always known to us as the living legend. He was embarrassed about that. But another occasion, it was in Maine, up in Portland, Maine, in 1988, 1984. At a Sunday afternoon rally at a high school for Gary Hart, and a group of us were standing in the back of the auditorium, and this place was crowded with all kinds of people, including a big batch of young girls, high school girls, and in a little lull in the ceremonies, one of the girls turned around and she looked over in our direction, and she shouted to her friends, "There he is, that fellow on television." and they turned it. They all ran toward us, and Chancellor was kind of squirming, and it hadn't been the first time, kind of embarrassed, and they ran right past us to a local TV guy from the Portland television station. So he was, of course, mortified, and we never mentioned it again.
Before we turn over the questions, let me give you a sort of off the wall, kind of questions. What's your favorite political city?
City? San Francisco.
San Francisco.
For the city, but not so much for the politics.
No, I'm talking about the political city, not for the eating, but for the political city.
Oh, I was going to then say New Orleans, but when you say not the eating, I can't put that one in.
Well, it's not about eating.
Well, I like to go to New Hampshire. I like not just the city, but the whole state of New Hampshire, because it's so convenient. It's so easy to get every place. All the candidates in one place. You say the same thing about Iowa, except Iowa is a lot bigger, and it's a little harder to get around.
Be glad to take questions. There's a question right here.
You said that newspapers counted in 1968. How would you characterize them in 2007?
That's a very sad story. I think the newspapers are, they may not be dying, but they're in dire straits. And I think that the reasons are obvious, that the advent of the internet is just punching holes through readership. Plus, you also have some news organizations. The zest to put out a good newspaper is not there because of changing generational ownerships of papers and so on. My own former newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, was a victim of the acquisition of the Los Angeles Times and its properties, which included the Baltimore Sun, by the Chicago Tribune. The Chicago Tribune has become a bottom-line organization. They've cut the staffs severely, and it's a trend that unfortunately is going right through the newspaper business, and I'm sure newspapers will survive, but there'll probably be less of them, and whether they'll be better, who can say?
Question?
And you envision what would have happened had Jim Baker been able to convince the Florida courts and the Supreme Court to agree with the Florida courts for a recount that would have made a different president.
Well, Jim Baker was on the winning side. It really was that the Democratic managers, including Bill Daley, the son of the mayor of Chicago, who made a bad decision in not insisting on a full recount at the outset. I think if that had happened, we would have had Al Gore would have been finishing his second term right now.
I'd like to pursue this question about the deterioration of journalism. In the old days, it used to require two sources to establish a fact, and then at some point that deteriorated to one source to establish a fact, and now it's largely individual opinions and very little sourcing. In fact, in economic news, in commodity news, you see the reference sources say, but no specific mention of who is sourcing these facts. What's happened? How did this happen?
Well, I think any good reporter would still require two sources if he can get them. In a competitive situation, quite often, if you have one source and you can substantiate it, editors will publish that. I don't find that in print journalism too many cases where a story gets through without a source. I think in some places editors don't require their reporters to tell them who the sources are. And I think that should never happen. That a reporter will say, "Well, it was given to me confidentially." There can't be any confidentiality between a reporter and his editor, as long as the editor himself is willing to abide to the confidentiality promise that's made. But I do think often on television and particularly on the internet, that vague sources say, or it is known, and that kind of attribution is too prevalent. I agree, and that's again a function of editorial judgment. I think if the reporter thinks he can get away with it, there should always be an editor there who bounces it back to him and says, "We've got to have a source on this story." It's basic.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
Comment about Jimmy Carter.
Pardon?
Jimmy Carter.
I have interesting experiences with Jimmy Carter. When he first ran, he used to make this speech about saying that he was going to reform and diminish government, the size of government, and he said he was going to take 200 agencies, which he never specified what they were, and reduce them to 19. He didn't say 18. He didn't say 20, 19. So at every opportunity I had, particularly during the primaries, when you had good access to the candidates, I would ask him to name one or two of these agencies that he would eliminate. And he always dodged me. He couldn't do it for one reason or the other. And so anyway, when I wrote a book about that campaign, 1976. And it was the first time I'd ever been actually into the Oval Office at the White House. I went in and to give him a copy of the book, and I inscribed it to him, and I said to President Carter, in recollection of our many revealing discussions about your reduction of the size of government. And he didn't. Every other occasion he would get that big Jimmy Carter toothy grin, and I got something between a smirk and a snicker.
Let me end this with what is, I think, real appropriate. Why don't you talk a few minutes about what you've seen here today? Because I think you were very impressed by this Dole Center, the museum, and about your recollections of Senator Dole.
Well, it's a marvelous place here, and I think certainly Bob Dole is worthy of this kind of recognition. I've said many times that of all the candidates I've ever traveled with, Bob Dole was the most pleasant and funniest campaigner I ever traveled with. He's a master of the one-liner, several of which I constantly use whenever I'm talking. And one of them was when he was running for re-election out here, and it was during the whole Watergate problem. And somebody asked him if he would like Nixon to come out and campaign for him. And Dole said, "I'd settle for a flyover in Air Force One." and another one of my favorites was that when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated, the president at the time, who I guess was Reagan, invited the living presidents to represent him at the funeral, and that would have been Jimmy Carter.
Nixon was alive. Nixon was alive, wasn't he?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter and Jerry Ford and Nixon. And so Dole came to the Gridiron Club in Washington, and he said, talking about this gesture to honor the slain president of Egypt. He said, talking about those three guys, he said, it reminds me of the three monkeys: see no evil, hear no evil, and evil.
With that, I think you're all invited to go to have a book signed by Jules. And with that, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and let's thank Jules again.